Thank you all for watching and supporting my videos. Your encouragement keeps me inspired to create even more content. My next big goal is to reach 1,000 subscribers, and I can't do it without your help. If you enjoy what I create, hit that subscribe button and join me on this journey. Now let's dive into the stories.
I was 42 when I decided it was time to change my life. After my divorce, I was looking for something new, a place where I could start fresh. And that's when I saw an ad on Craigslist. House for sale in a quiet neighborhood. Large property, perfect for singles or families. Below market price. Urgent. The photos looked appealing, a 2-story modern-style house, a big garden, a garage. The price was so low that I immediately called the seller. The seller, who introduced himself as Robert, explained that the house belonged to his brother, who had recently passed away. He couldn't afford to maintain it, so he wanted to sell quickly. We arranged to meet the next day. The house turned out to be even better than the photos. It was located on the outskirts of town, surrounded by woods. A large garden, a terrace, even a pond in the backyard. Robert was friendly, but for some reason, I felt like he was in a hurry. He showed me the house but avoided questions about the past. "Everything is fine here," he said. "My brother just loved solitude. That's why the house looks like no one has lived here for years." I agreed to the deal. The price was too good to refuse. The first days in the house were great. I enjoyed the peace, fresh air, and space. But then I began to notice strange things. At first, it was small things. I would find items I didn't remember placing. For example, an old clock I found on a shelf in the bedroom. Or a book I definitely didn't buy, but it was on the coffee table in the living room. Then I heard sounds. It was like someone was walking on the second floor. I went upstairs, but there was no one there. The sounds repeated every night. I decided to inspect the house more thoroughly. In the basement, I found an old box of documents. Among them was a diary. It belonged to the previous owner, Robert's brother. The diary was filled with notes about how he was watching someone. On the last pages, it said, "He knows that I know. I can't stop him anymore. He comes every night. He wants to take the house. He wants to take everything." I didn't know what to think. Who was this he? And why didn't Robert mention any of this? That night, I woke up to a sound. Someone was knocking on the door. I went to the window and saw a man standing on the doorstep. He was tall, wearing a dark coat, and his face was hidden in the shadows. I didn't open the door. Instead, I looked out of the second-floor window. The man was still standing there, but now he was staring directly at me. The next day, I called Robert. He didn't answer. I started searching for information about the house. In the local newspaper, I found an article about a disappearance. Robert's brother had disappeared about 5 years ago. He was never found. I decided to return to the basement. There, in the corner, I found something that sent chills down my spine. It was a photograph. It was of me. I was standing in front of the house, and behind me was the same man in the dark coat. That night, I heard the knocking again. I didn't open the door. But the next morning, I found something on the doorstep. It was a key. An old, rusty key. I don't know what to do. The house I bought has a secret. And I'm afraid that this secret could destroy me. The key I found on the doorstep marked the beginning of a new phase in my search. It was old, rusty, with a strange symbol on the handle, something like intertwined rings. I didn't know what it opened, but I instinctively felt it was connected to the house's mystery. I decided to ask the locals. In the nearby town, I found an old library that kept archives about the area. The librarian, a woman in her 70s, looked at the key and thought for a moment. "This symbol," she said. "It reminds me of something." "Wait a minute." She went to the back of the library and returned with an old book. The same symbol was on the cover. "This is a book about the history of this neighborhood," she explained. "The symbol belongs to a family that lived here many years ago. They were known for their strange customs." I took the book and began reading. It turned out that where my house stood, there had once been an estate belonging to the Graves family. They were wealthy, but their history was shrouded in mysteries. It was said they practiced occultism and held rituals in the basement of their house. The last member of the family, Edward Graves, disappeared in the 1950s. He was never found. I returned home with the book and the key. Something told me that the key opened something important. I decided to search the house again, focusing on the basement. The basement was large, with stone walls and a low ceiling. I started inspecting every corner. On one of the walls, I noticed something strange, a small metal plate embedded in the stone. It had the same symbol as the key. I inserted the key into the plate and turned it. There was a click, and part of the wall moved, revealing a passage. Behind it were stairs leading even further down. I grabbed a flashlight and descended. There was a small room furnished with antique furniture. On the table lay papers, photographs, and another diary. The diary belonged to Edward Graves. He wrote about how his family tried to contain something in the house. Something they had summoned during one of their rituals. He wrote that this thing became stronger and began to control them. On the last page, it said, "It won't let me leave. It wants more. If anyone finds this diary, be careful. It's still here." I felt the air in the room grow colder. I turned back to the stairs, but they were gone. In their place was just a wall. That night, I heard a voice. It whispered my name. I couldn't move. Over my bed stood a shadow, tall, with long arms. It leaned down to me, and I felt something cold touch my face. The next morning, I woke up in the basement. The door was open, and the key lay beside me. I don't know what happened that night, but I know one thing: the house will not let me go. I could no longer live in that house. Every night turned into a nightmare. The shadow that appeared in my room, the voices whispering my name, and the constant feeling that someone was watching me, it was driving me mad. But I knew I couldn't just leave. The house wouldn't let me go. I had to understand what was happening and stop it. I returned to Edward Graves' diary. It described the rituals his family performed to contain what they had summoned. The last entry was the most important. To be freed, the ritual must be completed. But it's dangerous. It doesn't want to leave. It will fight. I decided to try. I had no choice. I gathered everything I had found in the room beneath the basement: candles, an ancient book with symbols, and the strange amulet with the same symbol that was on the key. The ritual had to take place at midnight. I arranged the candles on the living room floor, forming a circle. In the middle, I placed the amulet and opened the book. The text was in Latin, but I found a translation in the diary. I began reading the words. At first, nothing happened. But then the candles flickered, and the air became thick. I felt something move in the corner of the room. The shadow I had seen earlier began to form. It was towering, with empty eyes and long, thin arms. "You can't banish me," the voice said. It was deep, as if coming from beneath the earth. "I am part of this place." I continued reading. The shadow moved closer, but I couldn't stop. When I uttered the last word, the amulet on the floor began to glow. The shadow howled, and I felt something cold pass through me. Then everything went silent. I woke up on the floor. The candles had burned out, and the amulet turned to dust. The shadow was gone. I went outside. The sun was rising, and the house looked normal. But I knew something had changed. I sold the house a month later. The new owners knew nothing about its history. I never told them what happened. But sometimes, when I drive past that neighborhood, I ask myself, did I really free the house from what lived inside? Or is it just waiting for a new owner? I've always dreamed of owning my own house. The idea of renting never appealed to me, so I spent a lot of time browsing Craigslist for potential deals. One evening, as autumn set in, I came across an ad that seemed too good to be true. House for sale in the suburbs, price to sell fast. Quiet area, perfect for a family. Need quick sale. The house was located a bit off the beaten path, in an area I didn't recognize, but it looked incredibly appealing. The price was well below the market value, and the description seemed like a dream, perfect for a young family like mine. I made the call the next morning. The person who answered was a man named Mark. His voice was soft, almost hesitant, as if he wasn't entirely sure about the sale. But the deal was too good to pass up. He told me the house had been in his family for years but that he was eager to sell quickly. I set up a meeting for later that week. When I arrived at the house, it was as described, charming, though slightly dated. A small, two-story home tucked away at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac. The garden was overgrown, the windows a bit dusty, but it had a certain warmth about it. Mark greeted me at the door, a man in his late 40s, with an almost apologetic look in his eyes. "I'm sorry it's a bit of a mess," he said as we walked through the front door. I wasn't expecting company. The inside was spacious but had a cold, uninviting air to it. The walls were bare, the furniture sparse. It felt like the house had been left behind. Mark mentioned that his family had moved out years ago, and no one had lived in the house for a long time. Still, it was hard to shake the feeling that something was off. We went through the rooms, and I took notes on what needed to be fixed. It was clear that the house required some work, but it had potential. As we reached the basement, Mark paused. "I wouldn't go down there," he said, his tone suddenly shifting. Curiosity got the better of me. I asked why, but he didn't respond immediately. After a long pause, he simply said, "Some things are better left undisturbed." I didn't press him further, but that comment stayed with me long after I left the house. Still, I was drawn to the idea of owning it. The price was too good, and I couldn't ignore the potential it had. I made an offer that night. A few days later, Mark accepted the offer, and I found myself officially purchasing the house. The process went quickly, and within a week, I had the keys in my hand. Mark wasn't around much during the final stages, and I never got any clear answers about the house's history, but I was eager to move in. The first few nights in the house were uneventful. But then, one evening, I heard something strange. It started with faint creaks, like footsteps on the floor above me. I thought it was just the house settling. But then it happened again, and this time it was accompanied by a soft whispering sound, almost as if someone was speaking just beyond the walls. I chalked it up to my imagination running wild, but as the days went on, the noises grew louder. It felt like someone, or something, was in the house with me. One night, I couldn't sleep. The whispers had escalated into full conversations, though I couldn't make out the words. I grabbed a flashlight and ventured down into the basement. The air was thick and damp, and the faint smell of mildew lingered. I reached for the light switch, but before I could flick it on, I felt a chill run down my spine. There, in the dim light, I saw something that made my blood run cold, a small wooden box sitting in the corner of the basement. It wasn't there the day I moved in. I walked over slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. The box was old, its edges chipped and worn. It was locked, but a small key was attached to it with a frayed piece of twine. My hand trembled as I picked up the key and unlocked the box. Inside, I found old photographs, images of the house from years ago, but there was something off about them. The people in the photos had strange, vacant expressions. Suddenly, I felt a hand on my shoulder. I spun around, but no one was there. The temperature in the room dropped, and the whispers grew louder, filling the basement like an eerie chorus. I ran back upstairs, heart racing, and locked myself in my bedroom. But no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, the house seemed to be calling to me, beckoning me to uncover its dark past. The more I tried to push it away, the more it consumed me. I reached out to Mark the next day, desperate for answers, but his number was disconnected. I went back through the paperwork, and when I checked the previous owner's name, Mark's name, it didn't exist. It was as if he had never been there. The house wasn't just a deal, it was a trap. And now, I was caught in its grip, unable to escape the whispers, the shadows, and the dark secrets buried beneath the floors. As days turned into weeks, the house's grip on me tightened. I couldn't leave. I couldn't sell it. And as the whispers grew louder, I began to understand the true cost of this house, a price far steeper than I could ever have imagined. And so, the story of my Craigslist house continues, but the more I search for answers, the more I realize. Sometimes the past isn't meant to be uncovered. As the days passed, I felt trapped, not just by the house itself, but by something far deeper. The whispers weren't just sounds anymore. They were voices, distinct and growing more insistent. Every corner of the house felt alive, watching me, following me. I began avoiding certain rooms, the basement, of course, but also the master bedroom, where I had started to feel an overwhelming presence. It was as if something was waiting for me there, something old and angry. I tried to reach out to friends, to family, anyone who could help me make sense of what was happening. But when I invited people over, they never felt the same unease. They couldn't hear the whispers. They didn't feel the cold spots that seemed to follow me from room to room. I was beginning to wonder if I was losing my mind. Then, one evening, I came across a note. It was lying on the kitchen counter, folded neatly as if someone had placed it there just moments before I walked in. The handwriting was neat, but the ink looked old, faded, almost as if it had been written decades ago. It read, "The house will take you, just as it took them. Don't go into the basement again." My heart raced. Who had left this note? And who was them? That night, I couldn't sleep. The whispering grew louder, like distant conversations echoing through the walls. My mind kept drifting to the basement. What was down there? What was hidden in the darkness? The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had to go back. I needed answers, and the only place I hadn't explored fully was the basement. Despite every instinct telling me to turn back, I grabbed a flashlight and descended the stairs once again. The air was thick and heavy, the dampness clinging to my skin. As I reached the bottom, I could feel the temperature drop even further. It was colder than I had ever experienced in the house. I tried the light switch, but the basement remained in darkness. The flashlight trembled in my hand as I moved forward. I hadn't been down there in a few weeks, but the scene had changed. The wooden box that I had opened before was gone. In its place, a small wooden chair sat in the middle of the floor. I approached it cautiously, my flashlight illuminating the dust-covered seat. A sense of dread washed over me. Suddenly, I heard it, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, as if someone was walking up behind me. I spun around, but no one was there. The air grew thick, oppressive, as if the house itself was closing in on me. I turned back to the chair. And there, on the seat, was something that hadn't been there before, a photograph. I picked it up, and my breath caught in my throat. It was a picture of me, standing in the living room, looking confused and frightened. But it wasn't just me in the photo. There were shadows in the background, dark figures, standing just beyond the doorway. Figures I hadn't noticed before. Figures I couldn't explain. In a panic, I dropped the photograph and stumbled back toward the stairs. But before I could make it to the top, a voice not my own, whispered from behind me. "You shouldn't have come back." I froze, the blood draining from my face. The whisper was low and raspy, and it sounded as if it was coming from the very walls themselves. I bolted up the stairs, slamming the door behind me. That night, the house felt different. The whispers were louder than ever, echoing through the halls, becoming a constant hum in the background of my every thought. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. I couldn't escape the feeling that something was watching me, waiting. I knew I needed to leave, but I was paralyzed. Every time I thought about packing up and leaving, a part of me felt as if I couldn't. The house had a hold on me. It wasn't just the creepy noises or the dark figures, it was something deeper. Something in my mind was tied to this place, and the more I resisted, the more it pulled me in. Days turned into weeks, and the house continued to haunt me. I couldn't leave town, couldn't get a decent night's sleep, couldn't find peace. I tried to sell it. I tried to contact realtors, but no one would take it off my hands. Every time I mentioned the house to anyone, the conversation would mysteriously end. As if the house had somehow woven itself into every part of my life, making it impossible to escape. The final straw came one night, when I returned home after work to find a message scrawled across the front door in what appeared to be blood. It simply said, "We are waiting." I ran, not looking back. I couldn't take it anymore. But as I left, I couldn't help but wonder, had the house always been this way? Or had something changed when I bought it from Mark? Had it been waiting for someone like me? Or had I been chosen by the house itself, drawn in by its dark, silent pull? I left everything behind, clothes, furniture, everything except the photos. I couldn't shake the thought that the house would come for me, no matter where I went. And so, my Craigslist house remains, waiting for its next victim. Because some houses aren't just homes, they're traps, pulling you deeper into their history, until you're no longer sure where the house ends and you begin. I thought that leaving the house behind would bring me peace. I rented a small apartment in the city, far from the quiet streets of that suburban neighborhood. For a while, it seemed like the nightmare was over. I tried to convince myself it had all been a bad dream, that the house had simply been an old, neglected property with quirks I couldn't understand. But the memories wouldn't fade. The whispers, the photograph, the figures in the background, they haunted me every waking moment. A month passed, and I thought maybe I could finally put it all behind me. But then, one evening, as I was going through old boxes in my apartment, I found something that made my blood run cold. It was the photograph. The one from the basement, the one with the shadows standing behind me. How was it in my apartment? I had left everything in the house, including the photo. I hadn't taken it with me. I stared at it, my fingers trembling. The shadows in the background seemed darker now, more defined. And this time, I saw something I hadn't noticed before. In the corner of the photo, just at the edge, there was a figure, a person, half hidden in the shadows. It was a man, standing in the doorway. His face was obscured, but I could make out the faint outline of his features. And it hit me, he looked just like Mark. I turned the photo over, hoping to find some explanation, but there was nothing written on the back. Only the cold chill that had followed me from that house seemed to return, wrapping itself around my chest. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to go back. I had to confront whatever had been waiting for me in that house. The next day, I drove out to the neighborhood again. I hadn't told anyone where I was going. I couldn't. They'd think I was crazy. But as I pulled up to the familiar street, I realized that it had changed. The house was darker, as if it had aged more in the past month than it had in the previous decades. The front door was wide open, the garden overgrown even more than I remembered. My heart pounded as I got out of the car and walked up to the house. The air felt thick, heavier than before, pressing down on me with every step I took. I hesitated at the door, but something inside me urged me to go in. The house was waiting for me. I stepped inside, and the familiar chill crept over me. Everything was as I had left it, yet somehow wrong. The air was stale, like it hadn't been touched in years. I called out, but there was no answer. No sign of anyone living here. Yet, the whispers began again, faint but insistent, echoing through the walls. I couldn't ignore them anymore. I needed to go down to the basement. I needed to find the truth. As I descended the stairs, I noticed something new. The walls were covered in strange symbols, carved deep into the wood. They weren't there before. I reached out to touch one of them, and instantly, the room felt colder. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, as if the house itself was breathing in sync with me. At the bottom of the stairs, I saw it. The chair was back, the same chair from before, sitting in the middle of the room. And beside it, the wooden box. It was open this time. The photographs were gone, but in their place was something else, a small, tattered notebook, its pages yellowed with age. I picked it up and flipped through it, my heart racing. The handwriting inside was familiar. It was Mark's. The entries were scattered, disjointed, and filled with paranoia. He had written about the house, about how it had been in his family for generations. He wrote about the voices, the figures, and the things that would happen when someone tried to leave. It was clear he hadn't been able to escape. But what chilled me the most was the last entry. It is not just the house. It's me. It is all of us who have lived here. We are the house now. I dropped the notebook, the words burning in my mind. It made sense now. Mark wasn't just selling a house. He was selling something far worse, something that would take hold of anyone who entered. And now, it had taken hold of me. Suddenly, the basement door slammed shut behind me, and the temperature dropped to freezing. The lights flickered, casting long, haunting shadows across the room. I spun around, but there, standing in the doorway, was the figure from the photograph, the man who looked like Mark. His face was more defined now, twisted in a way that no human face should be. His eyes were hollow, black voids that seemed to consume everything around them. "You shouldn't have come back," he whispered, his voice low and guttural. "You're ours now." I backed away, but the air around me seemed to constrict. I was trapped, unable to move or scream. The walls seemed to close in, and the whispers grew into a deafening cacophony. The house was alive, and it was pulling me in, claiming me as it had claimed everyone else who had stepped foot inside. In that moment, I realized the truth. The house was never just a building, it was a prison, a living, breathing entity that fed on the souls of those who tried to escape it. Mark had been its first victim, but not its last. I was next. And as the shadows closed in around me, I understood that there would be no escaping. The house would claim me, just as it had claimed so many before. I was never meant to leave. And now, neither will anyone else. The shadows around me pressed in, suffocating, as the man, Mark's twisted reflection, stepped closer. His hollow eyes bore into mine, and the whispers became a maddening chorus, louder and more insistent. It was as if the house itself was speaking through him, every creak of the floorboards, every breath of wine through the broken windows, an echo of its eternal hunger. "You shouldn't have come back," he repeated, his voice barely a whisper but somehow louder than anything I had ever heard. "You're part of it now. We all are." I tried to move, but my legs refused to cooperate. I was frozen, trapped in a place where time no longer mattered, where nothing could be trusted, not the walls, not the air, not even the ground beneath my feet. I turned toward the stairs, desperate to escape, but the way up had changed. The stairs themselves seemed to stretch and distort, like they were pulling further away the more I reached for them. The light flickered again, casting grotesque, shifting shadows that seemed to laugh at me as they danced along the walls. The temperature dropped even further. My breath came out in clouds of mist, and my body began to shake uncontrollably. This wasn't just cold. This was the kind of chill that sank into your bones, that froze your soul. And I realized, with a terrible clarity, that the house wasn't just a building anymore, it had become a living thing, feeding on the fear of those trapped within its walls. I turned back to face Mark's shadowed figure, my eyes wide with terror. "What do you want from me?" His lips curled into a twisted smile, but it wasn't a smile at all. It was a grimace, a reflection of the house's hunger. "We don't want anything," he said softly. "We take. We always take." The room seemed to tilt, and suddenly, I wasn't standing in the basement anymore. The walls had shifted, bending and warping like the house was alive, twisting reality itself. I found myself standing in the hallway again, the same hallway I had walked through countless times. The wallpaper, stained and peeling, seemed to pulse with life, the faint outlines of faces almost visible beneath the layers of grime. But this time, it was different. The faces were watching me, waiting. I tried to run, but the house wasn't finished with me yet. The door to the living room slammed shut, locking me in. I could hear the faint sounds of something moving behind me, the soft scrape of footsteps across the floor. The air was thick, choking, as if the house itself was closing in. I looked toward the back door, praying it was open, but I knew it was futile. The house had already made its decision. It had claimed me. And then, as I took one final step toward the door, I felt a presence behind me, a cold, heavy weight pressing down on my shoulders, pulling me back. I turned slowly, and there, standing at the far end of the hallway, was Mark, or what was left of him. His form was no longer human, but a shadow, a ghostly figure twisted by the house's power. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Instead, a low, guttural sound filled the air, an ancient, terrible sound that seemed to vibrate through my very bones. "Welcome home," he whispered. In that moment, I understood everything. The house wasn't just a place, it was a force, an entity that took the souls of those who stepped inside. And once you entered, there was no leaving. No escaping. No future. The whispers had grown to a deafening roar, all the voices of the house's previous victims, those trapped in its walls forever. They all called to me now, urging me to join them, to accept my place in the endless cycle of torment. I tried to scream, but my voice was swallowed by the house. The last thing I saw before the darkness took me was the photograph I had found in the basement, the one with the shadowy figures, my face among them now. And then, there was nothing. No escape. No end. Only the house. Always the house. It was waiting for the next victim, just as it had always waited. Just as it would always wait. And I would never be the last.